June 13th, 1942. 4 men emerge from the dark Atlantic waters onto a Long Island beach. They're soaking wet, disoriented, and carrying wooden crates filled with explosives. Just 4 days earlier, these men were in Nazi Germany, receiving final instructions from the Abwehr, Hitler's military intelligence service. Their mission: to cripple America's war effort from within, to blow up railroads, factories, and water supplies, to spread terror across a nation that believed itself safe behind 2 vast oceans. But here's what makes this story truly extraordinary. Within 2 weeks, all 8 saboteurs would be in FBI custody. Not because of sophisticated surveillance technology, not because of some dramatic shootout, but because one of them, a man who had lived in America for years, who had American friends, who remembered what freedom tasted like, would make a choice that would change everything. This is the story of Operation Pastorius, a story of betrayal and loyalty, of men caught between 2 worlds, of a plot so audacious it could have changed the course of World War II, and of the quiet courage of ordinary Americans who refused to let fear consume them, even as enemy agents walked among them, armed and ready to strike. What you're about to hear is not just a spy thriller, it's a window into one of America's most vulnerable moments and the choices that defined who we would become. To understand Operation Pastorius, we must first understand the men chosen to execute it. These weren't hardened SS officers or fanatical true believers. They were something far more complicated and far more human. George John Dasch was born in Spies, Germany, in 1903. As a young man, he didn't dream of conquest or glory. He dreamed of America. At 19, he worked as a waiter on the SS Imperator, sailing back and forth across the Atlantic, watching the New York skyline grow closer with each voyage. In 1922, he jumped ship and disappeared into the streets of New York City, joining the great wave of immigrants seeking a new life in the New World. For 13 years, Dasch lived the American dream, or at least his version of it. He worked as a waiter in fine restaurants. He married an American woman. He learned to speak English without an accent. He walked the same streets as millions of other New Yorkers, invisible in the great anonymous crowd of the city. But something gnawed at him. Perhaps it was homesickness. Perhaps it was the economic devastation of the Great Depression. Perhaps it was simply the restlessness of a man who never quite found where he belonged. In 1941, Dasch returned to Germany. The country he remembered from his youth had transformed into something unrecognisable. The Nazi regime had remade German society completely. There were parades, uniforms, flags everywhere. There was also hunger, fear, and the constant thunder of Allied bombs. Dasch found work at the German Foreign Office, but his American experience made him valuable to another organisation, the Abwehr. Lieutenant Walter Kappa, the Abwehr officer in charge of sabotage operations against America, saw in Dasch exactly what he needed: a man who knew America intimately, who could pass as American, who understood the rhythms and routines of American life. But Kappa fundamentally misunderstood what 13 years in America had done to Dasch's soul. Ernst Peter Berger was different. Born in Bavaria in 1906, Berger had been a true believer in the Nazi cause, at least at first. He joined the Nazi Party in 1923 during its earliest days. He was part of the SA, the brown shirts who fought communist militants in the streets of German cities. He was there during the party's rise to power, watching Hitler transform from a beer hall agitator to the Chancellor of Germany. But Berger's faith in National Socialism curdled after he witnessed Kristallnacht in November 1938. The orchestrated violence against Jewish homes, businesses, and synagogues shocked him. This wasn't the Germany he had fought for. He began to express doubts. In Nazi Germany, doubt was dangerous. By 1940, Berger found himself imprisoned in a concentration camp, not as a political enemy, but as a cautionary example of what happened to those who questioned the regime. His release came with strings attached. the Abwehr offered him a choice: volunteer for a dangerous mission to America or return to the camp. For Berger, this wasn't about ideology anymore. It was about survival. Heinrich Heink was a working-class man from Hamburg who had spent several years in the United States during the 1920s. He worked odd jobs, drifted from city to city, and eventually returned to Germany when the Depression made work impossible to find. When the Abwehr recruiters came calling, Heink saw an opportunity, not to serve the Reich, but to return to America, the place where he'd felt most alive. Richard Quirin, Herbert Haupt, Hermann Neubauer, Werner Thiel, and Edward Curling rounded out the group. Each had their own story. Each had their own reasons for accepting this mission. Some were true believers. Some were opportunists. Some were simply men trying to survive in a world that had become incomprehensible. The Abwehr's Sabotage school was located in Brandenburg, outside Berlin. For 3 weeks in April and May 1942, these 8 men trained in the arts of destruction. They learned how to make incendiary devices from common household materials. They learned about America's industrial infrastructure, the aluminum plants, the hydroelectric facilities, the railroad junctions that kept war materials flowing to the coast. They learned about timing pencils, detonators, and the precise amount of explosives needed to collapse a bridge. But they also received a different kind of education. They were taught to blend in, to remember American slang, to know baseball scores and movie stars, to understand that Americans didn't click their heels or stand at attention. They were taught to be invisible. Lieutenant Kappe was confident these men had all the tools they needed to succeed. They had $175,000 in American currency, an enormous sum in 1942. They had contacts in America who would provide safe houses and support. They had detailed target lists. They had 2 years to complete their mission, with orders to lie low at first, to establish themselves, to wait for the perfect moment to strike. What Kappe didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that George Dasch had already made a decision that would doom the entire operation before it even began. On May 26, 1942, the 8 saboteurs gathered at the port of Lorient in occupied France. U-202 and U-584, 2 Type VC U-boats, waited in the harbour. 4 men would board each submarine. They would cross the Atlantic submerged, emerging only at night to recharge batteries and refresh the stale air. It would be a voyage of nightmares, cramped, dark, terrifying. As the U-boat slipped beneath the waves and headed west into the vast Atlantic, each man carried his own thoughts. Some imagined glory, some imagined revenge against the country that had rejected them, some imagined simply staying alive. And George Dasch imagined something else entirely: redemption. The North Atlantic in June 1942 was among the most dangerous places on Earth. German U-boats prowled the shipping lanes, hunting Allied convoys. American destroyers and aircraft hunted the U-boats in return. The war that had seemed distant to most Americans was being fought just miles off their eastern shores, in cold waters where men died without anyone on land ever knowing they'd been there. 202, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Hans-Heinz Linder, carried Dasch, Berger, Heink and Quirin. The journey was everything they'd feared and worse. The submarine's interior was a maze of pipes, valves and machinery. The air grew thick and foul. Men slept in shifts in narrow bunks. The sound of the diesel engines, when running surfaced at night, was deafening. When submerged, there was only the electric hum of the motors and the creak of the hull under pressure. The men barely spoke to each other. In such close quarters, personality conflicts could become dangerous. Dasch kept to himself, reviewing his plans. Berger watched and waited, reading the others, trying to understand who might be trustworthy. The younger men, Heink and Quirin, seemed almost excited, treating the voyage like an adventure. After 16 days at sea, on the night of June 12, 1942, U-202 approached the coast of Long Island. Captain Linder brought the submarine up to periscope depth and scanned the shoreline near Amagansett. It was perfect saboteur territory, long stretches of beach with few houses, far from the city but close enough to reach by train. As midnight passed and June 13th began, 4 men prepared to wade ashore and begin their mission. They had no way of knowing that within hours their carefully planned operation would begin to unravel in ways none of them could have imagined. The surf was rough that night. Waves crashed against the inflatable raft as it made its way from U-202 to the shore. George Dasch, Ernst Berger, Heinrich Heineck and Richard Quirin were dressed in German military uniforms, a decision that would prove crucial later. According to international law, if captured in civilian clothes while conducting sabotage, they would be treated as spies and likely executed. In uniform, they would be prisoners of war. The plan was to change into civilian clothes immediately upon reaching the beach, bury the uniforms and equipment, then make their way to the Amagansett train station and catch the morning train to New York City. From there, they would disappear into the anonymity of 8 million people. The raft grounded on the beach around 12:30 a.m. The men stumbled out, dragging heavy wooden crates filled with explosives, timing devices and detonators. The beach was dark except for starlight. In the distance, the dim glow of a few houses. Everything seemed to be going according to plan. Then they saw the light. Seaman Second Class John C. Cullen, 21 years old, was on beach patrol for the Coast Guard. His station at Amagansett had been established after Pearl Harbor as part of America's coastal defense system. His job was simple: walk the beach, watch for anything unusual, report back. It was usually boring work. Occasionally he'd find flotsam from sunken ships. Sometimes he'd see oil slicks from U-boat attacks farther out to sea. But tonight, through the fog, he saw figures on the beach, moving shapes, the sound of voices speaking a language that didn't sound like English. Cullen approached, his hand on the pistol at his belt, though he knew confrontation wasn't his job. He was supposed to observe and report. But these men had seen him. There was no turning back now. "Who are you?" Cullen called out. "What are you doing here?" George Dasch stepped forward from the group. His mind raced. Everything depended on the next few minutes. In that moment, Dasch made a series of decisions that revealed both his cunning and his ultimate intentions. "We're fishermen," Dasch said in unaccented English. "Our boat ran aground. We're just trying to get our gear off the beach." Cullen wasn't convinced. Something was wrong. The fog was thick, but not thick enough to explain why fishermen would be out at this hour. And there was something about these men, the way they moved, the nervous energy, that set off every instinct he'd developed during months of patrol. "I need to see your fishing permits," Cullen said, taking another step closer. Dash's hand went to his pocket. For a terrible moment, Cullen thought the man might be reaching for a weapon. Instead, Dasch pulled out a thick fold of American bills. "Look," Dasch said quietly, "you don't want to get involved in this. Take this money. Forget you saw us. Go back to your station. Tell them you didn't see anything." He pressed $260 into Cullen's hand, more money than a Coast Guard seaman made in months. Behind Dasch, one of the other men, Berger, called out something in German. Cullen's blood ran cold. These weren't fishermen. These were Germans, enemy agents, on American soil. But Cullen was outnumbered and outgunned. The men on the beach had rifles. He had a pistol he'd probably never fired in combat. He was alone in the fog with 4 men who could kill him and bury his body in the sand before anyone knew he was missing. "I don't want any trouble," Cullen said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "I'm going to head back now." "That's smart," Dasch said. "Very smart. Remember, you didn't see anything." Cullen backed away slowly, never turning his back on the men. When he was far enough away, he ran. He ran faster than he'd ever run in his life, his boots kicking up sand, his heart hammering. He burst into the Coast Guard station shouting about Germans on the beach, about money pressed into his hand, about men speaking a foreign language. His commanding officer, Warrant Officer Warren Barnes, initially thought Cullen might be drunk or hallucinating, but Cullen was insistent, and he had the money to prove it. $260 in cash, small bills, American currency. Barnes made a phone call to the main Coast Guard station. Then he gathered every available man and headed toward the beach with flashlights and weapons. By the time they arrived, the saboteurs were gone. But they'd left evidence behind. In their haste to escape, they'd buried their equipment poorly. The Coast Guard men dug up wooden crates filled with explosives, detonators, and incendiary devices. They found German military uniforms. They found a soggy pack of German cigarettes. This wasn't some confused fisherman. This was an enemy landing on American soil. By dawn, the beach was swarming with Coast Guard personnel, local police and FBI agents summoned from New York City. Tracking dogs were brought in. They followed a scent trail from the beach to the Amagansett train station, where it disappeared. The saboteurs had made it to the station just after dawn. Still wearing damp clothes, carrying their suitcases packed with American clothes and money, they bought tickets to New York City. The station agent noticed nothing unusual. Just 4 men, probably workers, heading to the city for jobs. It was a common enough sight in 1942. The train pulled into Pennsylvania Station at 8:45 a.m. George Dasch, Ernst Berger, Heinrich Heinck, and Richard Quirin stepped onto the platform and dissolved into the crowds of Manhattan. They had made it. Despite the encounter on the beach, despite leaving evidence behind, they were free in the largest city in America. 4 days later, on June 17th, a second U-boat, U-584, surfaced off Ponte Vedra Beach near Jacksonville, Florida. Edward Curling, Herbert Haupt, Herman Neubauer, and Werner Thiel waded ashore without incident. No Coast Guard patrol spotted them. They buried their equipment in the dunes, changed into civilian clothes, and made their way to Jacksonville, then on to Chicago and New York. Operation Pastorius was now fully deployed. 8 trained saboteurs with explosives, money, and detailed target lists were loose in America. The FBI knew that at least 4 enemy agents had landed on Long Island, but they had no names, no photographs, no idea where these men had gone. What the FBI didn't know was that George Dasch had already decided to betray the mission. But Dasch's path to betrayal wouldn't be simple or straightforward. He was about to discover that turning yourself in as a Nazi saboteur was far more complicated than he'd imagined. Back in Amagansett, John Cullen sat in the Coast Guard station, giving statement after statement to FBI agents. He described the men, their accents, the money, the German words he'd heard. He was shaken but proud. He'd faced down enemy agents and lived to tell about it. He'd done his duty. Years later, Cullen would say that the scariest part wasn't the confrontation itself. It was the walk back to the station afterward, knowing that the men he'd just encountered could have killed him without a second thought. It was the realization of how vulnerable America's vast coastline truly was. It was understanding that the war wasn't just happening on distant battlefields, it had come home. In the days following the landing, panic rippled through the coastal communities of Long Island. Coast Guard patrols were doubled. Civilians reported suspicious activity, most of it imagined, some of it real. Everyone was on edge. The Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor. Now Germans were landing on American beaches. In Washington, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover received the reports with grim determination. This was exactly the kind of threat he'd warned about. Enemy saboteurs, fifth columnists, the war coming to the American homeland. He mobilized every available agent. He called in favors from local police departments. He prepared for what he assumed would be a long, difficult manhunt. What Hoover didn't know was that the case was about to solve itself in the most unexpected way possible, because George Dasch, sitting in a New York hotel room with Ernst Berger, was about to make a phone call that would change everything. The Martinique Hotel on West 57th Street in Manhattan wasn't luxurious, but it was anonymous, exactly what George Dasch and Ernst Berger needed. They checked in on June 14th, using false names, paying cash. Around them, New York City pulsed with wartime energy. Men in uniform crowded the streets. Factory whistles blew shift changes. Newspapers screamed headlines about Allied victories and defeats. Inside their hotel room, Dasch and Berger faced a moment of truth that neither man had fully anticipated during their training in Germany. "We need to talk," Dasch said, locking the door. Berger knew what was coming. He'd watched Dasch during the submarine crossing. He'd seen the doubt, the hesitation. During their training in Germany, Berger had sensed something in Dasch that the Abwehr officers had missed, a fundamental ambivalence about the entire mission. "I'm not doing this," Dasch said flatly. "I'm not blowing up American factories. I'm not killing American workers. This isn't why I came back." Berger studied his companion carefully. This was a dangerous conversation. In Nazi Germany, expressing doubt about a mission could get you shot. But they weren't in Germany anymore. They were in America, and that changed everything. "What are you proposing?" Berger asked. "I'm going to turn us in," Dasch said. "I'm going to the FBI. I'm going to tell them everything. The whole operation, the other team in Florida, the targets, everything. But I need to do it right. If I just walk into an FBI office and say I'm a German saboteur, they'll think I'm crazy. Or worse, they'll arrest me before I can explain." Berger considered this. He'd already decided he wanted no part of sabotaging America either. His experience in the concentration camp had cured him of any illusions about the Nazi regime, but Dasch's plan was incredibly risky. "You realise they'll execute us anyway," Berger said. "We landed on an American beach in German uniforms with explosives. That's espionage. The penalty is death." "Maybe," Dasch said. "But if we cooperate fully, if we help them catch everyone, maybe they'll show mercy. At least we won't have innocent blood on our hands." It was a gamble, a desperate gamble. But for Dasch, it was also about something deeper than survival. During his 13 years in America, he'd absorbed something of the American character, the belief in second chances, in redemption, in the possibility of transformation. He'd seen how America treated even its poorest citizens with a basic dignity that was absent in Nazi Germany. He'd watched Americans help each other through the Depression. He'd witnessed ordinary generosity. Dasch wasn't a hero. He was a complicated man trying to navigate an impossible situation. But in that moment, he made a choice that revealed his true loyalties. The problem was how to contact the FBI in a way that would be taken seriously. Dasch couldn't just walk into the New York FBI office and announce he was a German saboteur. He'd seen enough movies to know he'd likely be dismissed as a crank. He needed a more strategic approach. On Friday, June 19th, 6 days after landing, Dasch took a train to Washington, D.C. He left Berger in New York with instructions to stay quiet and wait. Dasch checked into the Mayflower Hotel, another establishment that catered to anonymous guests with cash. Then he picked up the telephone and called the FBI headquarters. "This is George Dasch," he said when the switchboard operator answered. "I need to speak to J. Edgar Hoover. I have information about German saboteurs who have landed in America." The operator was unimpressed. The FBI received dozens of such calls every day. Conspiracy theorists, attention seekers, frightened citizens, reporting neighbours with German surnames. "I'll connect you to an agent," she said. "You don't understand," Dasch insisted. "I'm not calling to report saboteurs. I am a saboteur. I came ashore on Long Island 6 days ago with 3 other men. There's another team of 4 in Florida. I want to surrender and tell you everything." There was a long pause. Then the operator connected him to Special Agent Dwayne Traynor. Traynor had heard every kind of story during his years with the FBI, but something about this call felt different. The man's voice was calm, detailed, specific. He wasn't ranting, he was methodical. He gave dates, locations, names. He described the U-boat landing. He mentioned the Coast Guard encounter at Amagansett, an incident the FBI was actively investigating. "Don't move," Traynor said. "Stay at your hotel. Agents are coming to get you." Within an hour, FBI agents arrived at the Mayflower Hotel. They found George Dasch in his room, waiting calmly. He had laid out everything on the bed: his money, his forged documents, maps of targets, lists of contacts. It was the intelligence equivalent of a gift-wrapped package. "I want to speak to Mr. Hoover personally," Dasch said. "I have information that will help win the war." The agents were sceptical but intrigued. They brought Dasch to FBI headquarters and began what would become a 13-day interrogation. Dasch talked. He talked about everything: the Sabotage school in Germany, the U-boat crossing, the other team's landing in Florida. He provided addresses where the other saboteurs might be found. He drew diagrams of explosive devices. He explained the entire infrastructure of the Abwehr's sabotage division. The FBI agents took notes, cross-referenced information, and slowly realised they had stumbled into the intelligence coup of the war. But they also faced a profound dilemma: what to do with Dasch. He was simultaneously an enemy saboteur who had landed illegally on American soil with the intent to commit acts of war, and the most valuable intelligence asset the FBI had ever acquired. He was guilty of espionage, but was also cooperating fully. He was a traitor to Germany, but potentially a saviour of American lives. Edgar Hoover himself interrogated Dasch. The FBI director was fascinated by this complicated man who spoke perfect English, understood American culture intimately, and yet had willingly returned to Nazi Germany only to betray his mission. "Why?" Hoover asked. "Why did you come back to America only to turn yourself in? What's your angle?" Dasch struggled to articulate something that made sense even to himself. "I lived here for 13 years, he finally said. "I know Americans. I have American friends. I couldn't blow up factories knowing that workers would die. Men with families. Men like the men I worked with when I was a waiter in New York. It's not about politics. It's about what I can live with." Hoover didn't entirely believe him. The FBI director suspected Dasch had lost his nerve, or perhaps had always intended to betray the mission and had volunteered only to come back to America. But it didn't matter. Dasch was cooperating, and that's what counted. Using Dasch's information, the FBI began rounding up the other saboteurs. Ernst Berger was arrested at the Hotel Governor Clinton in New York on June 22nd. He immediately confessed and provided additional details. Heinck and Kirin were found at separate locations in Manhattan and arrested without incident. The Florida team proved only slightly more difficult to locate. Edward Curling was arrested in New York on June 27th. Herbert Haupt was caught in Chicago the same day. Herman Neubauer and Werner Thiel were arrested in New York on June 28th. In less than 2 weeks, the entire operation had been rolled up. 8 saboteurs arrested. Tons of explosives seized. Not a single act of sabotage completed. It was, from the FBI's perspective, a spectacular success. But the FBI faced a delicate public relations problem. If they revealed that one of the saboteurs had turned himself in voluntarily, it would diminish the Bureau's accomplishment. J. Edgar Hoover wanted the public to believe that the FBI had cracked the case through brilliant detective work, not because a saboteur had surrendered and handed them the solution, so the FBI crafted a narrative. They announced that through intensive investigation and superior detective techniques, they had apprehended 8 Nazi saboteurs before they could commit any acts of sabotage. Newspapers trumpeted the story. Americans felt relief and pride. The FBI looked omniscient and unstoppable. What the public didn't know was that George Dasch had given them the entire case on a silver platter. And Dasch, sitting in an FBI holding cell, began to realise with growing horror that his cooperation might not save him after all. The other saboteurs, when they learned that Dasch and Berger had betrayed them, reacted with predictable fury. They'd trusted Dasch as the team leader. They'd believed they were all committed to the mission. Now they faced execution because of his betrayal. Herbert Haupt, the youngest of the group at 22, was particularly bitter. He'd grown up in Chicago after his family immigrated in the 1920s. He'd gone to American schools, played American sports, dated American girls. He'd only gone to Germany in 1941 to visit relatives and got trapped there when the war escalated. The Abwehr had recruited him because of his American background, and he'd agreed mainly because it meant getting back to Chicago. Now he faced a military tribunal and likely death because Dasch had talked. In their cells, the 8 men awaited their fate. They had no contact with the outside world, no lawyers initially, no way to send messages to families. They existed in a legal limbo, not quite prisoners of war, not quite civilian criminals, not quite anything with established rights. The United States government had to decide how to handle this unprecedented situation. Saboteurs had landed on American soil for the first time since the War of 1812. The public was terrified. There was pressure to respond decisively. But how? President Franklin Roosevelt made the decision. The saboteurs would face a military tribunal, not a civilian trial. This meant different rules of evidence, no jury, and potential death sentences that could be carried out immediately. On July 2, 1942, President Roosevelt issued Executive Proclamation 2561, establishing a military commission to try the 8 saboteurs. The trial would be held in secret. The verdict would be final. There would be no appeals. George Dasch, sitting in his cell, realised with growing dread that his cooperation might have bought him nothing but a longer life in prison, while his comrades went to the electric chair. He had betrayed Germany. He had handed the FBI a perfect case, and he might still die for it. The military tribunal for the Nazi saboteurs began on July 8, 1942, in a 5th-floor assembly room of the Department of Justice building in Washington, D.C. Outside, summer heat baked the Capitol. Inside, behind closed doors, 8 men faced a military commission that would determine whether they lived or died. The secrecy surrounding the trial was unprecedented in American legal history. No press was allowed, no public observation. Families of the accused weren't notified. The proceedings were classified. Even years later, many details would remain obscured. 7 military officers served as the commission, led by Major General Frank McCoy. The prosecution was headed by Attorney General Francis Biddle. The defence was provided by 2 military lawyers, Colonel Carl Ristine and Colonel Kenneth Royal, both competent attorneys who found themselves in an almost impossible position. How do you defend men who landed on American beaches with explosives and detailed plans to sabotage war industries? How do you argue innocence when the evidence is overwhelming and your clients admit to being German saboteurs? And how do you mount a meaningful defence when the entire proceeding is designed to reach a predetermined conclusion? Colonel Royal understood immediately that he couldn't win acquittal for his clients. The best he could hope for was to establish some legal precedents that might be useful in future cases, and perhaps to argue for mercy based on cooperation. The prosecution's case was straightforward and devastating. They presented the explosives recovered from the beaches. They showed the jury forged documents, German money converted to American dollars, lists of targets. They called John Cullen to testify about his encounter with the saboteurs on the Amagansett beach. Coast Guard officers described finding the buried equipment. FBI agents detailed the arrests. Then they called George Dasch. Dasch took the stand expecting to be treated as a cooperative witness. Instead, he was cross-examined as a hostile saboteur. The prosecution walked through his entire history, his years in America, his return to Germany, his training in sabotage, his landing on Long Island. Yes, he had turned himself in. Yes, he had provided information. But he had also participated in the operation. He had landed on an American beach, wearing a German uniform and carrying explosives. "Did you intend to commit acts of sabotage?" the prosecutor asked. Dasch hesitated. The truth was complicated. He'd participated in the training. He'd crossed the Atlantic on a U-boat. He'd come ashore with the others. But from the beginning, he'd planned to betray the mission. How could he explain that in a way that would save his life? "I intended to return to America," Dasch said carefully. "I intended to prevent the sabotage from happening. I intended to protect American lives and property." "But you accepted money from the German government to commit sabotage, correct?" "Yes, but—" "You received training in how to build explosive devices, correct?" "Yes, but I never—" "You landed on an American beach in a German uniform, carrying materials intended for sabotage operations, correct?" "Yes." There it was. No matter how much Dasch had cooperated, no matter his intentions, the facts were damning. He was guilty under any reasonable interpretation of the law. Ernst Berger testified next. He corroborated Dasch's story about planning to betray the mission from the start. He described his own disillusionment with the Nazi regime, his time in a concentration camp, his horror at what Germany had become. He presented himself as a man who had cooperated with the FBI immediately upon being arrested. The prosecution's response was brutal. If you truly opposed the Nazis, why did you participate in the mission at all? Why didn't you refuse? Why didn't you turn yourself in immediately upon landing, instead of waiting days while Dasch contacted the FBI? The younger saboteurs, Heinck, Quirin, Haupt, Curling, Neubauer, and Thiel, had no defence at all. They hadn't turned themselves in. They hadn't voluntarily cooperated. They'd been arrested while attempting to carry out their mission. Some tried to claim they'd been coerced into participating. Some insisted they were loyal Germans following orders. Some simply sat silently, understanding that nothing they said would matter. Herbert Haupt's testimony was particularly poignant. At 22, he was by far the youngest of the saboteurs. He'd grown up in Chicago, attended American schools, worked American jobs. His defense attorney painted him as a naive young man who'd been manipulated by the Abwehr, who'd simply wanted to return to his family in Chicago, who'd never truly committed to the sabotage mission. But the prosecution countered with evidence that Haupt had purchased a car after landing in America, had visited his parents in Chicago, and had made no attempt to contact authorities. If he truly opposed the mission, why had he acted like a man settling back into American life while preparing for sabotage operations? Haupt had no good answer. The truth was that he'd been ambivalent, not fully committed to the sabotage, but not brave enough to betray it either. That ambivalence would cost him his life. The defence attorneys attempted several legal arguments that would have been interesting in a normal trial, but fell flat before a military tribunal operating under emergency wartime powers. They argued that the saboteurs should be treated as prisoners of war since they'd landed in military uniforms. The prosecution countered that they'd immediately changed into civilian clothes and buried their uniforms, thus forfeiting POW status. They argued that the military tribunal itself was unconstitutional, that the saboteurs should face trial in civilian courts with full constitutional protections. The prosecution cited the Articles of War and the President's constitutional authority as Commander-in-Chief during wartime. They argued that the secrecy of the proceedings violated the defendant's rights. The prosecution argued that wartime security necessitated secrecy. Every argument failed. The military commission was not interested in legal nuances. They were interested in swift justice that would reassure the American public and deter future sabotage attempts. Colonel Royal, recognising that legal arguments were futile, shifted strategy. He began arguing for mercy, particularly for Dasch and Berger. These two men had betrayed the mission. They had provided crucial intelligence. They had potentially saved American lives and prevented significant damage to war industries. Didn't that count for something? Didn't cooperation deserve some recognition? The prosecution's response was chilling. Cooperation doesn't erase the crime. These men still participated in an act of war against the United States. They still landed on American soil with hostile intent. The penalty for such actions was death, regardless of subsequent cooperation. Outside the closed doors of the tribunal, America was engaged in a furious debate about justice and security. Some Americans demanded immediate execution as an example to other would-be saboteurs. Others argued for fair trials and due process, even for enemy agents. Civil liberties organisations raised concerns about secret military tribunals operating without public oversight. President Roosevelt was unmoved. He believed that wartime required extraordinary measures. He had authorised the internment of Japanese Americans on the West Coast, a decision that would later be recognised as one of the darkest chapters in American history. He had no qualms about approving a military tribunal for German saboteurs. The trial lasted from July 8th to August 1st. For 3 weeks, testimony and evidence accumulated. The outcome was never in doubt. On August 3rd, the military commission reached its verdict. All 8 saboteurs were found guilty and sentenced to death. But the commission added a recommendation for clemency for George Dasch and Ernst Berger based on their cooperation with the FBI. Their sentences were reduced. Dasch to 30 years in prison, Berger to life imprisonment. For the other 6 men, there would be no mercy. They were scheduled for execution on August 8th, 1942. In their cells, the condemned men faced their final week. Some wrote letters that would never be delivered. Some prayed. Some raged against the injustice of being executed, while Dasch and Berger received prison sentences. Some simply waited with numb resignation. Herbert Haupt's parents learned of their son's conviction through newspapers. They had no opportunity to visit him, no chance to say goodbye. They would spend the rest of their lives haunted by the question of whether they could have done something differently, whether they'd failed their son by not somehow preventing him from going to Germany in 1941. The American legal system had processed the Nazi saboteurs with extraordinary speed. From landing to execution would take less than 2 months. It was efficiency, certainly, but was it justice? Years later, legal scholars would debate whether the military tribunal was constitutional. The Supreme Court had reluctantly upheld it in ex parte querin, but several justices had private doubts. The case established precedents that would be cited decades later in debates about Guantanamo Bay and military tribunals for terrorists. But in August 1942, with the war going badly on multiple fronts, with American casualties mounting in the Pacific and North Africa, with U-boats still sinking ships within sight of the American coast, there was little appetite for legal nuance. Americans wanted protection. They wanted decisive action. They wanted to know that their government could defend them. The military tribunal gave them that reassurance, but it came at a cost that would echo through American jurisprudence for generations. August 8, 1942, dawned hot and humid in Washington, D.C. While most of the city went about normal Saturday activities, a grim scene unfolded at the District of Columbia jail. 6 men were prepared for execution. Edward Curling, Herbert Haupt, Heinrich Heintig, Richard Quirin, Hermann Neubauer, and Werner Thiel. They had been given their final meals. They had met with a chaplain, though none of them were particularly religious. They had written letters that would be held by the government and not delivered for years, if ever. The method of execution would be electrocution. The electric chair at the DC jail had been used sparingly over the years, mostly for civilian criminals convicted of murder. Never before had it been used for enemy combatants. Edward Curling, the leader of the Florida group, was the first to die. At 33, he was the oldest of the condemned men. He had spent years in the United States during the 1920s and 1930s, working various jobs, before returning to Germany in 1940. Unlike Dasch, Curling had been a true believer in the Nazi cause. He viewed his mission as a legitimate act of war, and he went to his death without expressing any regret. At 12:02 p.m, Curling was strapped into the electric chair. The leather straps were tightened around his chest, arms and legs. The electrodes were attached to his shaved head and leg. A leather mask was placed over his face. "Do you have any final words?" the warden asked. Curling said something in German that the assembled witnesses didn't understand. Then the executioner pulled the switch. 2,000 volts surged through Curling's body. His body stiffened against the straps. Smoke rose from the electrodes. After the first shock, a doctor checked for a heartbeat. Finding one, the executioner administered a second shock. At 12:04 p.m, Edward Curling was pronounced dead. His body was unstrapped and removed. The chair was cleaned. The next condemned man was brought in. Herbert Haupt went to the chair at 12:14 p.m. At 22, he was the youngest. He had been crying in his cell, crying as they led him down the corridor, crying as they strapped him into the chair. He was terrified in a way the older men weren't. They had lived full lives. He had barely started his. "I'm sorry," Haupt said through his tears. "I didn't mean for any of this. I just wanted to come home." Those were his last words. The switch was pulled. Herbert Haupt's young body convulsed as electricity coursed through it. He was pronounced dead at 12:16 p.m. Heinrich Heinck was executed at 12:24 p.m. He went quietly, stoically, accepting his fate with the resignation of a man who'd run out of options long ago. Richard Quirin followed at 12:34 p.m. He had maintained his innocence to the end, insisting he'd never truly intended to commit sabotage, that he'd been following orders, that he'd been trapped by circumstances. It didn't matter. The switch was pulled. He died at 12:36 p.m. Hermann Neubauer was executed at 12:44 p.m. He had spent his final hours writing a letter to his mother in Germany, trying to explain how he'd ended up in an American prison facing execution. The letter would never be delivered. Werner Thiel was the last. He entered the execution chamber at 12:54 p.m. He was 40 years old, the second oldest of the group. He'd spent his last week in stoic silence, refusing to speak to guards or fellow prisoners. As they strapped him into the chair, he finally spoke. "It was always going to end this way," he said in accented English. "From the moment we left Germany, we were dead men." The switch was pulled for the final time. At 12:56 p.m, Werner Thiel was pronounced dead. In less than an hour, 6 human beings had been executed by the United States government. Their bodies were removed and buried in a Pastorius field on government property. No markers identified the graves. No families were notified of the burial locations. The executed saboteurs simply disappeared from the world as thoroughly as if they had never existed. In a different part of the jail, George Dasch and Ernst Berger heard the sounds of the executions. They couldn't see what was happening, but they knew. 6 of their former comrades were dying while they lived. The guilt and relief mixed into something almost unbearable. Dasch spent the rest of his life grappling with that day. He had betrayed the mission to prevent loss of life. But 6 men had still died. Men he'd trained with, crossed the Atlantic with, landed on American shores with. Yes, they would have committed sabotage if given the chance. But they'd also been human beings with families, with histories, with complicated reasons for making terrible choices. Had Dasch done the right thing? He believed he had, but belief didn't erase the weight of what had happened. The executions were announced to the public on August 8th. Newspapers ran banner headlines: "Nazi saboteurs executed." The public reaction was overwhelmingly positive. Americans felt vindicated. The government had acted swiftly and decisively. The message to Nazi Germany was clear. Attempts to sabotage America would be met with the harshest possible response. But there were dissenting voices. Some civil libertarians expressed concern about the speed of the trial and the lack of public oversight. Some questioned whether military tribunals were appropriate for prisoners who could have been tried in civilian courts. Some wondered about the precedent being set. The American Civil Liberties Union issued a statement noting that while the saboteurs were undoubtedly guilty, the process by which they were tried and executed raised serious constitutional questions. These concerns would prove prescient, as the Operation Pastorius case would be cited in legal debates for decades to come. In Germany, the executions were reported differently. Nazi propaganda portrayed the executed men as martyrs who had bravely attempted to strike at the American homeland. Their families received official condolence letters from the German government, though these letters carefully avoided mentioning that Dasch and Berger had betrayed the mission. The parents of Herbert Haupt were destroyed by their son's execution. They had emigrated to America to give their children a better life. They had worked hard, paid taxes, become part of their Chicago community, and now their son had been executed as a Nazi saboteur. The shame and grief were overwhelming. They would live the rest of their lives in quiet obscurity, never speaking publicly about what had happened. John Cullen, the Coast Guard seaman who had encountered the saboteurs on the beach, received a commendation and a small promotion. He had done his duty, and his actions had led to the capture of enemy agents. But Cullen was haunted by the encounter for the rest of his life. He would wake up in the middle of the night remembering the moment when Dasch pressed money into his hand, remembering the German voices in the fog, remembering the fear. Years later, in interviews, Cullen would say that he'd done what anyone would have done in that situation. But he also wondered about the men he'd encountered. Who were they really? What had driven them to attempt something so desperate? And what had become of the one who had pressed money into his hand and let him walk away alive? The answer to that last question was complicated. George Dasch and Ernst Berger remained in federal prison. Dasch in particular expected that his cooperation would eventually lead to clemency and release. He had given the FBI everything. He had prevented acts of sabotage. Surely that counted for something. But J. Edgar Hoover had no interest in releasing Dasch. The FBI director had crafted a narrative in which the Bureau had brilliantly detected and apprehended the saboteurs through superior investigative work. Releasing Dasch would undermine that narrative. If the public learned that Dasch had turned himself in voluntarily, it would diminish the FBI's accomplishment. So Dasch remained in prison, year after year, watching his 30-year sentence tick by. He wrote letters to government officials pleading for clemency. He maintained that he had always been loyal to America in his heart. He insisted he deserved recognition for his cooperation. The letters were filed away and ignored. As far as the United States government was concerned, George Dasch was a Nazi saboteur who had received mercy by not being executed. That he had betrayed his mission was irrelevant. He had still participated. He had still landed on an American beach with hostile intent. That was enough. Ernst Berger fared slightly better psychologically. He had fewer illusions about redemption. He understood that his life sentence was exactly what it sounded like. He would die in prison. He accepted this with a kind of grim stoicism born from his experiences in Nazi concentration camps. American prison was harsh, but it wasn't Sachsenhausen. He was alive. That was more than he'd expected. The executions of August 8, 1942, sent ripples through the German intelligence community. The Abwehr immediately suspended all sabotage operations targeting the American mainland. If Operation Pastorius, carefully planned and executed, could fail so completely, what hope did other operations have? The risk was too high, the reward too uncertain. Nazi Germany would never again attempt to land saboteurs on American soil during World War II. The executions had achieved their deterrent effect. But they had also exposed something uncomfortable about American justice during wartime. The speed of the trial, the secrecy of the proceedings, the military tribunal structure, all of these raised questions that would haunt American legal discourse for generations. Were these men given a fair trial? Did they receive adequate defence? Was justice served, or merely expedience? These questions have no simple answers. War creates impossible situations where normal rules break down. The saboteurs had landed on American beaches carrying explosives and detailed plans for sabotage. They were, by any reasonable definition, enemy combatants engaged in acts of war. But they were also human beings, however flawed, who deserved some form of due process. The execution of 6 men in less than an hour on a Saturday afternoon in August 1942 represented both America's commitment to defending itself and the moral compromises that war demands. It was necessary and terrible, justified and troubling, a moment of strength and weakness simultaneously. And in the end, 6 men died, 2 men remained imprisoned, and America moved forward, carrying the weight of those deaths into an uncertain future. The war moved on. By August 1942, American forces were preparing for Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa. The Battle of Stalingrad was reaching its apocalyptic climax. The Pacific War raged across thousands of miles of ocean. The execution of 6 Nazi saboteurs became a footnote, a brief moment of domestic drama quickly overwhelmed by global catastrophe. But for George Dasch and Ernst Berger, imprisoned in federal penitentiaries, time moved differently. Days became weeks, weeks became months, months became years. The war they'd briefly touched continued without them. They aged in cells, forgotten by almost everyone except themselves. Dasch was transferred to the federal penitentiary in Atlanta, Georgia. Prison life was harsh but orderly. He worked in the prison laundry. He read books from the prison library. He wrote letters, endless letters to government officials, to the FBI, to anyone who might remember that he had cooperated, that he had betrayed the Sabotage mission, that he deserved clemency. Most of his letters received no response. A few generated form replies thanking him for his correspondence and noting that his case was not currently under review for clemency. The bureaucratic indifference was crushing. Berger was sent to a different facility. His life sentence meant he had even less hope of release than Dasch. But Berger adapted better to prison life. Perhaps his time in a Nazi concentration camp had given him tools for psychological survival that Dasch lacked, or perhaps he simply accepted his fate more completely. The 2 men lost contact with each other. In the federal prison system of the 1940s and 1950s, communication between inmates in different facilities was prohibited. They couldn't write letters. They couldn't know how the other was faring. Each man faced his imprisonment alone. Other prisoners knew their story, or fragments of it. In the coded social hierarchy of prison, Nazi saboteurs occupied an ambiguous position. Were they political prisoners, war criminals, traitors, ordinary criminals? The answer depended on who was asking and for what purpose. Some prisoners respected Dasch and Berger as men who had fought against America and lost. Others viewed them as cowards who had betrayed their mission. Still others simply saw them as inmates to be avoided, men whose presence attracted unwanted attention from guards and prison administrators. Dasch struggled with his identity in profound ways. He had been born in Germany. He had lived 13 years in America. He had returned to Germany and volunteered for a sabotage mission. Then he had betrayed that mission and given the FBI everything they needed to destroy Operation Pastorius. Who was he? What was he? German, American, traitor, patriot, coward, hero? The confusion ate at him. He developed stomach ulcers. He suffered from depression. He had nightmares about the 6 men who had been executed. Men who had died in part because of his betrayal. In his dreams, they confronted him, asking why he had the right to live while they died. Prison psychiatrists evaluated Dasch periodically. They found a man consumed by guilt and confusion, by a desperate need for vindication. He wasn't insane, but he was deeply troubled. The psychiatrists recommended counselling. In the 1940s and 1950s, prison counselling was rudimentary at best. Dasch talked to chaplains sometimes, but it didn't help. His crisis was existential, not spiritual. Ernst Berger found a different path. He became deeply involved in the prison education program, teaching English to other German prisoners and taking courses himself. He discovered a talent for languages and began learning Spanish. Education became his escape, his way of maintaining dignity in an environment designed to strip it away. Outside the prison walls, America transformed. The war ended in 1945 with victory in both Europe and the Pacific. American soldiers returned home. The economy boomed. The suburban expansion began. The Cold War replaced the Hot War. Senator McCarthy launched his communist witch hunts. Korea exploded into conflict. The 1950s brought prosperity and anxiety in equal measure. Through all of this, Dasch and Berger remained imprisoned, increasingly forgotten. Occasionally, a journalist would write a retrospective article about Operation Pastorius, and the two surviving saboteurs would receive a few letters from curious Americans, but mostly they were invisible. In 1948, Dasch filed a formal petition for executive clemency. He argued that his 30-year sentence was unjust given his cooperation with the FBI. He noted that he had prevented acts of sabotage that could have killed hundreds of Americans. He provided sworn affidavits from FBI agents acknowledging his cooperation. The petition was denied without explanation. In 1951, he filed again, denied. In 1954, he filed again, denied. Each rejection deepened his despair. He began to understand that he would serve his full sentence, that his cooperation meant nothing, that the United States government had no interest in acknowledging the complexity of his actions. But in 1948, something unexpected happened. President Harry Truman, reviewing the cases of wartime prisoners, granted executive clemency to Ernst Berger. Berger's life sentence was commuted to time served, and he was deported to Germany. Berger returned to a country he barely recognised. Germany was divided, occupied, devastated. The Nazi regime that had sent him on the sabotage mission was gone, its leaders dead or imprisoned. In place of the Third Reich was rubble, hunger, and the slow, painful work of reconstruction. Berger settled in the American zone of occupation and found work as a translator. His knowledge of English made him valuable in the post-war administration. He kept his head down, avoided publicity, and tried to build a quiet life from the ruins of his past. He never spoke publicly about Operation Pastorius. When journalists occasionally tracked him down, he politely declined to comment. His time in American prison had taught him the value of silence. Berger died in 1975, in relative obscurity. He left no memoirs, no interviews, no final statement about his role in the sabotage mission or his betrayal of it. Whatever lessons he'd learned, whatever insights he'd gained, died with him. George Dasch remained imprisoned. With Berger released, Dasch felt even more isolated. Why had Berger received clemency and not him? Both had betrayed the mission. Both had cooperated with the FBI. What made Berger's case different? The answer, as near as anyone could determine, was arbitrary. Truman's Clemency Review Board had looked at Berger's case and decided that a life sentence was excessive. They had looked at Dasch's 30-year sentence and decided it was appropriate. There was no deeper logic to it. In 1948, Dasch filed a lawsuit challenging his conviction. He argued that the military tribunal had been unconstitutional, that he should have been tried in civilian court, that his cooperation should have resulted in immunity from prosecution. The lawsuit wound through the federal court system for years, generating volumes of legal briefs and depositions. In 1953, the lawsuit was ultimately dismissed. The courts ruled that the military tribunal had been constitutional under wartime emergency powers, and that Dasch's voluntary participation in the sabotage mission negated any claim to immunity. Dasch was devastated. He had believed that the American legal system would eventually recognise the injustice of his imprisonment. Instead, the courts had validated his conviction. He had no options left. He would serve his full sentence. In 1954, after serving 12 years in prison, Dasch was unexpectedly granted executive clemency by President Dwight Eisenhower. His sentence was commuted to time served, and he was ordered deported to Germany. Dasch's release was controversial. Some Americans believed he should have served his full 30 years. Others argued he should never have been imprisoned at all. The debate played out in newspaper editorial pages, but by 1954 most Americans had forgotten Operation Pastorius entirely. The controversy faded quickly. Dasch was placed on a ship bound for Germany in 1954. He arrived in Bremerhaven with no money, no prospects, and no welcome. The German government viewed him with suspicion. He was a traitor who had betrayed a German military operation. The American government had expelled him. He belonged nowhere. He settled in a small apartment in West Germany and found occasional work as a translator and tutor. He lived on the margins of society, barely making enough to survive. He continued writing letters to American officials, pleading for recognition of his cooperation, for financial compensation, for acknowledgement that he had tried to do the right thing. The letters were mostly ignored. Occasionally he received polite but non-committal responses. No compensation was ever offered. No official acknowledgement of his cooperation was ever made public. In 1959, Dasch published a book about his experiences titled 8 Spies Against America. It was his attempt to tell his side of the story, to explain his motivations, to claim the recognition he believed he deserved. The book sold poorly. Critics noted its self-serving tone and questioned Dasch's portrayal of himself as a hero. American intelligence agencies reviewed the book and determined that it revealed no classified information. It was simply one man's version of events, coloured by bitterness and disappointment. They filed it away and moved on. Dasch spent his final years in increasing poverty and obscurity. He developed various health problems. He had few friends. He lived alone in his small apartment, surrounded by scrapbooks of newspaper clippings about Operation Pastorius, evidence that his life had once mattered, that he had once been part of something significant. He died in 1992 at the age of 88, largely forgotten. His death received brief mentions in a few American newspapers, noting him as the last survivor of the Nazi sabotage plot. The obituaries were short and factual. They didn't grapple with the complexity of his choices or the ambiguity of his legacy. What should we make of George Dasch? Was he a hero who prevented acts of sabotage that could have killed Americans? Was he a traitor who betrayed his comrades? Was he a coward who lost his nerve? Was he an opportunist trying to save his own skin? The answer is probably all of these things, and none of them. Dasch was a complicated man who made a series of choices in impossible circumstances. He tried to serve two masters and satisfied neither. He sought redemption, but found only rejection. He wanted to be remembered as a hero, but died as an exile. His story reveals something uncomfortable about loyalty, patriotism, and the moral complexity of war. We want clear heroes and villains. We want simple narratives of good versus evil, but real human beings rarely fit those categories neatly. Dasch saved American lives by betraying Operation Pastorius. That's indisputable. But he also participated in the operation initially. He landed on an American beach carrying explosives. He wore a German uniform. He accepted money from the Nazi government to commit sabotage. Can we hold both truths simultaneously? Can we acknowledge that his betrayal of the mission was noble, while also recognising that his participation in it was criminal? Can we accept that someone can be both hero and villain, depending on which part of the story we examine? These are not easy questions. They're the kind of questions that war forces us to confront, whether we want to or not. And they're the questions that haunted George Dasch for the rest of his life, unanswered and unanswerable. Operation Pastorius failed completely. Not a single act of sabotage was committed. Not a single factory was damaged. Not a single railroad bridge was destroyed. From Nazi Germany's perspective, it was a catastrophic waste of resources, training, and human capital. But from a broader historical perspective, the operation's failure illuminates something profound about the nature of loyalty, identity, and the human capacity for moral choice under pressure. Consider what had to happen for Operation Pastorius to fail so completely. 8 men had to be recruited, trained, and deployed. They had to cross the Atlantic in U-boats, a journey fraught with danger even without the Allied naval blockade. They had to successfully land on American beaches. They had to infiltrate into American society without being detected. All of this went according to plan. The operation failed not because of tactical errors or poor planning. It failed because one man, George Dasch, chose betrayal over loyalty to his mission. That choice is worth examining closely. Dasch wasn't a spy who had been planted by American intelligence. He wasn't a double agent working for the Allies. He was a genuine German recruit who had volunteered for the mission. His betrayal came from within, from some internal compass that pointed toward America, despite his German birth and recent years in Nazi Germany. What does it mean to be loyal? To what do we owe our allegiance? These questions seem simple until we examine lives like Dasch's. He was born German but lived 13 formative years in America. He absorbed American values, American culture, American ways of thinking. When he returned to Nazi Germany, he found himself in a society that had become alien to him. The Germany of his youth was gone, replaced by something darker. His participation in Operation Pastorius suggests he wasn't simply an American patriot. If he had been, he would have immediately contacted the American embassy in Germany or refused the mission outright. Instead, he went through with the training, crossed the Atlantic, and landed on Long Island. Only then did he turn himself in. This suggests a more complicated internal process. Perhaps Dasch saw the mission as an opportunity to return to America, the place where he felt he truly belonged. Perhaps he planned from the beginning to betray the mission once back on American soil. Perhaps he was genuinely conflicted and only decided at the last moment on the beach at Amagansett. We'll never know for certain. Dasch gave multiple, sometimes contradictory accounts of his motivations over the years. This isn't necessarily evidence of lying. It's more likely evidence of a man trying to make sense of his own choices, trying to craft a coherent narrative from a decision that may have been intuitive rather than calculated. Ernst Berger's choices are similarly revealing. Berger had been a true Nazi believer until reality intruded. Kristallnacht shattered his illusions. Imprisonment in a concentration camp completed the process. By the time he was recruited for Operation Pastorius, Berger had become profoundly disillusioned with the Nazi regime. Yet he participated in the mission. He crossed the Atlantic. He landed on American shores carrying explosives. Only after Dasch revealed his intention to betray the mission did Berger commit to cooperation. This suggests that Berger's moral compass was activated by Dasch's example rather than by his own independent choice. This is significant. Berger had more reason than Dasch to hate the Nazi regime. He'd experienced its brutality firsthand in a concentration camp, yet he needed Dasch's leadership to translate that hatred into action. This reveals something important about moral courage. It's easier to follow someone else's brave choice than to make that choice yourself. The other 6 saboteurs, those who were executed, represent a different kind of loyalty. They didn't betray the mission. They were arrested while attempting to carry out their orders. They went to the electric chair maintaining, for the most part, that they were German soldiers following orders. Were they heroes or villains? From the Nazi perspective, they were martyrs who died attempting to strike at the American homeland. From the American perspective, they were enemy saboteurs who got what they deserved. But from a more nuanced perspective, they were men who made the choice to remain loyal to their mission, even when presented with the opportunity for betrayal. Herbert Haupt is particularly interesting. At 22, he was young enough that he might have claimed youthful naivety. He'd grown up in Chicago. He had American friends and family. He could have turned himself in and claimed he'd been coerced. Instead, he went to Chicago after landing, visited his parents, bought a car, and began preparing for sabotage operations. He made an active choice to remain loyal to his mission. That choice killed him, but it was a choice nonetheless. We can condemn the choice while still recognising the courage it took to make it. Loyalty to a bad cause is still loyalty. It's misguided, certainly, but it reflects a certain strength of character, however misapplied. This raises uncomfortable questions about moral judgment. We want to believe that doing the right thing is always rewarded, and that doing the wrong thing is always punished. Operation Pastorius complicates that narrative. Dasch did the right thing by American standards. He betrayed a Nazi sabotage mission and prevented loss of American life. His reward was 12 years in prison, followed by deportation and a life of poverty and obscurity. The 6 saboteurs who remained loyal to their mission were executed swiftly. From a certain perspective, they suffered less than Dasch did. They died quickly rather than spending decades wrestling with guilt, confusion and rejection. This isn't to suggest that Dasch should have remained loyal to the Nazi mission. It's simply to acknowledge that moral courage doesn't always lead to happy endings. Sometimes doing the right thing costs you everything. Sometimes the reward for preventing catastrophe is indifference and rejection. The FBI's treatment of Dasch is particularly troubling. He handed them a complete intelligence coup. Without his cooperation, the investigation would have taken months and might have failed completely. The FBI would have been searching for 8 men with no names, no photographs, no leads, needle in a haystack work that might never have succeeded before the saboteurs struck. Instead, Dasch gave them everything: names, descriptions, locations, plans, targets. It was gift-wrapped. The FBI solved the case in less than 2 weeks, and J. Edgar Hoover took credit for brilliant detective work. The Bureau's unwillingness to acknowledge Dasch's contribution reveals something about institutional pride and the construction of official narratives. Hoover wanted the FBI to look omniscient and all-powerful. Admitting that a saboteur had turned himself in voluntarily would have diminished that image. So Dasch's contribution was minimised, then buried, then forgotten. This institutional ingratitude had real consequences. It meant that Dasch received no official recognition for his cooperation. It meant that requests for clemency were denied repeatedly. It meant that he died in poverty rather than receiving the pension or compensation that might have been appropriate for someone who had prevented significant damage to American war industries. The lesson here is sobering. Institutions protect their own narratives, even at the expense of individual justice. The truth matters less than the story the institution wants to tell about itself. Operation Pastorius also reveals something about America's vulnerability during World War II. The saboteurs landed successfully on 2 separate beaches. They infiltrated into American society. If Dasch hadn't betrayed the mission, they might have operated for months or even years before being detected. The extensive American coastline was essentially undefendable against small-scale infiltration. This vulnerability was real and terrifying. The executions of 6 saboteurs were meant to send a message. Attempts to attack the American homeland would be met with swift, harsh justice. The message was received. Nazi Germany never again attempted to land saboteurs on American soil during the war. But the fear persisted. Americans began to see potential saboteurs everywhere. Anyone with a German surname faced suspicion. German-American communities were infiltrated by FBI informants. Paranoia flourished. This paranoia led to injustices. Japanese Americans were interned in camps based on nothing more than their ethnic background. German and Italian Americans faced discrimination and suspicion. The Coast Guard patrol that John Cullen was part of was just one element of a massive, expensive, and largely ineffective coastal defence system. The irony is that the greatest threat to Operation Pastorius came not from external defences, but from internal moral conflict. John Cullen's encounter with the saboteurs on the beach was important, but it wasn't decisive. The saboteurs escaped that encounter and made it to New York. What destroyed the operation was Dasch's choice to betray it. This suggests a different approach to security, one focused less on external defences and more on understanding what creates and maintains loyalty. Dasch's years in America had given him ties to the country that proved stronger than his German birth or Nazi training. Those ties, formed through work, friendship, and lived experience, created a loyalty that couldn't be overcome by ideology or orders. Perhaps the lesson of Operation Pastorius isn't about better coastal patrols or more intensive security screening. Perhaps the lesson is about the power of inclusion, of allowing people to become part of a society so completely that they'll defend it even against their own nominal loyalties. Dasch defended America, not because he was ordered to, but because he chose to. That choice came from his 13 years of living as an American, from his absorption of American values and culture, from his sense that America was where he belonged. The United States failed to honour that choice. They imprisoned Dasch, took credit for his cooperation without acknowledging it publicly, denied his requests for clemency repeatedly, and eventually deported him. This was not America at its best. It was America frightened, America self-protective, America willing to sacrifice individual justice for institutional narrative. But it was also America defended by one man's moral courage, one man's choice to betray his orders and his comrades in service of a loyalty deeper than nationalism or ideology. George Dasch may have died in obscurity and poverty, but his choice in June 1942 saved American lives and prevented significant damage to the American war effort. That deserves to be remembered, not as propaganda or hero worship, but as an example of the moral complexity that war creates and the courage required to navigate impossible choices. Operation Pastorius failed because one man chose betrayal over loyalty, conscience over orders, moral intuition over ideological certainty. It's a messy story with no clear heroes and no simple lessons. But that messiness is precisely what makes it valuable. Real moral choices are messy. Real human beings are complicated. Real heroism often looks like betrayal from one angle and courage from another. George Dasch was all of these things: betrayer, hero, coward, patriot, collaborator, and saviour. He was a man who tried to do right and was punished for it. He was a man who sought redemption and found rejection. He was a man who made one crucial choice at a crucial moment, and that choice changed history. We should remember him not as a simple hero or villain, but as a reminder of how complicated loyalty and courage can be, and how rarely those who make difficult moral choices receive the recognition they deserve. That's the real lesson of Operation Pastorius.